March 7, 1945. The banks of the Rhine River, Germany. A heavy mist hangs over the water, shrouding the landscape in an eerie calm. The air is thick with anticipation, as if the very atmosphere knows that history is about to bend. Lieutenant Colonel John O'Keefe stands at the water's edge, his brow furrowed with uncertainty. A seasoned soldier at 40, he is weary but resolute, his eyes scanning the horizon where the distant roar of engines stirs the silence. "We're ready," he mutters under his breath, clutching a crumpled map filled with hastily scribbled notes. Behind him, soldiers bustle about, their faces a mix of excitement and dread. Corporal Lewis, fresh-faced and anxious, approaches. "Sir, do you really think they can do it?" he asks, his voice barely above a whisper. O'Keefe turns, locking eyes with the young man. "We have no choice. The enemy is fortified across the river. This is our chance." In the distance, the sound grows louder, a symphony of might and innovation. The first American tanks drive forward, their engines thrumming like a war drum. Each movement is deliberate, an answer to the German general's deep-seated fears. What he didn't know was that this idea would change the war. If stories like this fascinate you, make sure to hit that subscribe button and comment below. March 7th, 1945. The Rhine River, Germany. The world stands on the precipice of a relentless storm. In the months leading up to this fateful day, the Allied forces have pushed through Europe, leaving a trail of devastation in their wake. Victory in Europe seems tantalizingly close, yet the challenges ahead are monumental. The Rhine, a natural barrier, stretches like a dark artery through the heart of Germany, fortified by the remnants of the Wehrmacht and their defensive lines. The Rhine had long stood as an insurmountable obstacle for invading armies. The river, wide and treacherous, was heavily defended by layers of artillery, mines, and thousands of German soldiers, all prepared to meet any attempt at crossing with fierce resistance. Military strategists had long debated the best approach to conquer this formidable geographical barrier. Previous attempts at crossing major waterways in World War II, such as the Seine and the Po, had resulted in costly failures, with high casualty rates and retreating forces. Statistics reveal the grim reality. In multiple operations, Allied forces had suffered over 200 Zaren casualties while attempting to breach fortified positions. Each failed crossing brought with it a consensus from military experts. The Rhine could not be crossed without devastating losses. "It's impossible," they would say, shaking their heads in disbelief. "We can't afford the risk." The fortified German defenses along the Rhine had been meticulously constructed over years, a testament to the Nazi regime's desperate bid to protect their homeland. Machine gun nests lined the banks, and tank traps lay hidden beneath the murky waters, waiting to ensnare any foolish enough to attempt a crossing. Reports filtered in from reconnaissance missions, detailing the vast concentrations of troops and equipment amassed on the opposite shore. The German High Command had every reason to believe that the Allied advance would halt at the Rhine. Yet, in the face of such daunting odds, American ingenuity was about to unfold a revolutionary solution. Lieutenant Colonel John O'Keefe, though troubled, carried a flame of determination ignited by necessity. He was a man shaped by the brutal lessons of previous battles, a veteran who had witnessed both valor and defeat. The weight of his command pressed heavily upon him, as he understood that the success of the operation would not only determine the fate of his men, but also shape the course of the war. The Americans had been working tirelessly to devise new methods for overcoming the obstacles before them. Engineers and soldiers collaborated day and night, pooling their knowledge to find a way to breach the defenses of the Rhine. A series of experimental projects were initiated, but most had ended in failure. Traditional methods would not suffice. America needed a breakthrough. The concept of utilizing amphibious tanks, capable of swimming across the river's expanse, was considered radical and fraught with peril. "Nothing worked," echoed the defeatist tone of the engineers. Despite the initial enthusiasm, designs were scrapped and prototypes repeatedly failed tests. The setbacks were disheartening, leading to conversations that circled back to the same conclusion. The Rhine remained an impassable barrier. In the depths of the military command, frustration began to boil over. Experts agreed. It couldn't be done, a senior officer stated bluntly, dismissing the notion of amphibious vehicles as mere fantasy. Each word dripped with the authority of years of military tradition, a tradition steeped in caution and conservatism. The fear of incalculable losses loomed large over their discussions, and many simply could not shake the image of ships and tanks sinking beneath the waves. O'Keefe, however, had a different vision. He envisioned a daring assault that would not only catch the Germans off guard, but also redefine the way wars were fought. He understood that a successful crossing would not only drive a wedge into the heart of Germany, but would symbolize hope and resilience for the Allies. Yet, as he looked around the war room, he felt the weight of doubt creeping in. Would his superiors support his unorthodox strategy, or would they dismiss him as another dreamer in a war riddled with failed dreams? Amidst the growing despondency, O'Keefe gathered his closest advisors, a mix of combat veterans and engineers who believed in his vision. They huddled over blueprints and sketches, hearts racing with the tantalizing prospect of possibility. But each failed iteration cast a longer shadow over their discussions. The fear of failure gnawed at them, reminding them of the heavy toll of war. One misstep could result in catastrophe. As March 7th loomed ever closer, the air thickened with anticipation. O'Keefe spent sleepless nights grappling with the looming crisis, his mind a battlefield of despair and hope. The thoughts raced through his mind. What if we fail? What if we succeed? Each question seemed to mock the very essence of his courage. Would the history they were to write be one of triumph or tragedy? While the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the Rhine in shadows, a thought flickered in O'Keefe's mind, a glimmer of what could be. If they could just get the tanks to float, they could harness the element of surprise and break through the German defenses. But as dawn approached, the reality weighed down heavier. The Rhine was a formidable guardian, and the stakes were higher than ever. His heart raced as he felt the pulse of history beneath him. He gathered his breath, clenching the map filled with notes, knowing that something had to give. Time was running out, and with it, the chance to change everything. What he didn't know was that this idea would change the war. If stories like this fascinate you, make sure to hit that subscribe button and comment below. March 1945. As the chilling winds howled around the Rhine, a flicker of hope ignited in the mind of a young engineer named Charles. At just 29, he was far from the battlefield, nestled in a nondescript office at the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers in Paris. He was a dreamer, a man who saw beyond the muck and mire of military despair. His fingers danced over blueprints, mapping out solutions to problems that had dogged Allied forces for months. The image of the Rhine loomed large in his mind, a vast expanse of turbulent water separating their forces from victory. He could hear the whispers of his fellow engineers, lamenting the river's might. "It's impossible. We need a bridge," they said. "A bridge over that? You're dreaming." Those words echoed in his head as he stared at the thick, dark river. One afternoon, during a rare moment of quiet reflection, Charles gazed down at his drawings. His eyes lit up as an idea struck him. What if tanks didn't need a bridge? What if they could swim? What if, he murmured aloud, we could make them amphibious? His mind raced with possibilities. Visions of Sherman tanks gliding across the Rhine, defying logic and overcoming a seemingly insurmountable barrier. But the moment he shared his vision with his colleagues, skepticism flooded the room. "That's the stupidest thing I've ever heard," scoffed Major Bennett, the lead engineer. "Tanks are designed for land. Water, they'll sink like stones." The words stung, but they ignited something in Charles, a fierce determination to prove them wrong. Alone in his thoughts, he contemplated the enormity of the task. The army had lost countless lives trying to cross the river, and here he was, toying with a reckless idea. "What if I could save lives?" he thought, his mind swirling with the implications. Days turned into weeks as he quietly gathered materials, sketching designs in the dead of night by the dim light of a flickering bulb. He envisioned a system that involved buoyant pontoons attached to the sides of the tanks, allowing them to float. Each night, with the shadows as his only company, he worked tirelessly, fueled by the dream of changing the tide of war. One stormy evening, amidst the patter of rain against the window, an unexpected ally emerged. Captain Lisa Wells, a brilliant engineer with a ferocious spirit, crept into his makeshift workshop. "I heard rumors of your crazy idea," she said, crossing her arms defiantly. "You need help." Charles looked up, both surprised and cautious. "Are you sure? They think it's impossible." "I think it's brilliant," Lisa countered, a spark igniting in her eyes. "Imagine the look on the Germans' faces when our tanks glide right past their defenses." As they exchanged ideas, the tension in Charles's chest began to ease. Together, they brainstormed, refined, and built prototypes in secrecy, their bond strengthening with each challenge they overcame. The first test was nerve-wracking. The sound of the tank's engine roared to life, sending a thrill through Charles. "This is it, Lisa. It's our moment," he breathed, anticipation coursing through him. With bated breath, they drove the modified Sherman tank to the edge of a shallow lake. Charles's heart raced as the machine rolled into the water, the pontoons bobbing against the waves. Come on," he chanted, his hands clenched tightly against the steering wheel. The first attempt ended in disaster. The tank began to tip, the side pontoons unable to sustain its weight. It sank, leaving Charles and Lisa standing in disbelief, drenched and defeated. "I told you it was a stupid idea," Major Bennett's voice echoed in Charles's mind, but he refused to let despair take root. Determined, Charles and Lisa spent sleepless nights analyzing their mistakes, adjusting the design and reinforcing the pontoons. Failure had become their teacher. Days later, they returned to the water's edge, now armed with newfound knowledge and relentless hope. "Ready?" Lisa asked, her eyes alight with defiance against the odds. "Let's do this," Charles replied, his voice a steady resolve. The tank splashed into the water once more, this time floating steadily. As it glided across the surface, a wave of exhilaration washed over them. They cheered, their voices mingling with the sounds of the rippling water. Yet, the true test loomed ahead, crossing the Rhine. Hot on their heels was the sound of retreating footsteps from the command tent, where senior officers discussed strategies. They had grown weary of their failures and were reluctant to try anything untested. "We can't risk more lives on a wild invention," a gruff voice argued. But Charles felt the urgency in his chest. He had to show them. He had to convince them of the potential that lay within his idea. He gathered the courage to approach Major Bennett, his heart pounding. "Sir, I need you to listen. I have something that could change everything." Bennett raised an eyebrow, clearly unconvinced. "We've been down this road before, Charles. It's a waste of time." "It can work," he insisted, desperation creeping into his voice. "We can save lives, cross the Rhine without losing soldiers. Please give me a chance." Something in Charles's fervor caught Bennett off guard. With a sigh, He relented. Fine, but if this fails, it's on you. Armed with newfound hope and a flicker of approval, Charles and Lisa prepared for the ultimate test. Their hearts raced as they envisioned the upcoming crossing. Could they really change the course of the war? What he didn't know was that this idea would change the war. If stories like this fascinate you, make sure to hit that subscribe button and comment below. April 12th, 1945. Paris, France. The air buzzes with anticipation, a tension that crackles like static electricity in the dimly lit office of the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. Shadows dance on the walls, and the sound of distant artillery echoes through the city, a reminder of the world outside. Charles, a wiry young engineer with tousled hair and sharp eyes, sits hunched over his blueprints, the fervor of his vision igniting a fire in his belly. His mind races as he glances at the clock. Time is of the essence. The Allied forces are poised at the Rhine, ready to advance, yet they face a formidable obstacle, the river's swift current and the enemy's stronghold. We need an edge, he mutters under his breath, scribbling notes in the margins of his plans. Suddenly the door swings open, interrupting his thoughts. Charles! Lieutenant Colonel Morgan strides in, his uniform crisp and posture rigid. I hear you have something to share. Sir, I believe I have a solution that can turn the tide, Charles replies, his voice steady but laced with excitement. Morgan leans closer, skepticism etched on his face. What is it? We don't have time for fantasies. An amphibious tank, sir. One that can cross the Rhine without losing momentum, Charles explains, gesturing animatedly at his designs. It can navigate water and land seamlessly. Think of the advantage we could have. The colonel raises an eyebrow, stepping back. That's the stupidest thing I've ever heard. Charles's heart sinks, but he presses on. We've seen the enemy fortifications. If we can deploy these tanks, we could breach their lines before they even realize what's happening. Morgan crosses his arms, the weight of command heavy upon him. And where do you propose we get these tanks? We're not in the business of untested prototypes, especially with lives at stake. But in that moment of doubt, a flicker of determination ignites within Charles. I'll find a way, sir. I can't let this idea die. The colonel's gaze softens for just a moment, but the skepticism returns. Days pass, and the din of war grows louder. The city feels like it's on the brink of collapse, yet Charles remains undeterred. He spends late nights in the lab, poring over diagrams, drawing inspiration from the resilience of the Allied forces. With time slipping away, he knows he must take matters into his own hands. Charles reaches out to an old friend, Captain Sarah Collins, a skilled engineer stationed nearby. They meet in a quiet cafe, the smell of coffee mixing with the tension in the air. Are you serious about this? Sarah asks, eyebrows knitted together in concern. The risks are astronomical. I know, he replies, his voice steady. But if we don't try, we'll never know. We could save countless lives, Sarah. After a moment of contemplation, she leans in closer. What do you need? We'll need a tank as a prototype, and I'll need your expertise to adjust its design for water mobility. It's time to test the impossible. Over the next few weeks, a clandestine operation begins to unfold. Under the cover of darkness, Charles and Sarah work tirelessly in an abandoned warehouse, piecing together a modified Sherman tank. The roar of machinery drowns out the distant sounds of war, making it feel like a world apart. As the days turn into sleepless nights, Charles feels the weight of his ambition. The tank takes shape, and with each bolt they secure, his hope grows. This will work, he whispers to himself, but self-doubt creeps in. What if I'm wrong? On April 24th, The prototype is finally ready. The sun rises behind a veil of clouds as they roll the tank out of the warehouse. A sense of accomplishment swells within Charles, but it's tempered by the enormity of what lies ahead. "Are you ready for this?" Sarah asks, her eyes sparkling with a mix of excitement and fear. Charles nods, determination etched on his face. No turning back now. They head to a secluded section of the Seine River, away from prying eyes. As the tank sits on the banks, Charles glances at Sarah, acknowledging the risk they're about to take. "If this fails—" "We'll make it work," she interrupts, a fierce resolve in her voice. With the river before them, Charles climbs into the driver's seat, heart pounding in his chest. He turns the ignition, and the engine roars to life, echoing against the tranquil waters. "Here goes nothing," he mutters, and with a deep breath, he shifts into gear. The tank lurches forward, rolling down the ramp and into the water. For a moment, it hovers at the edge. Then it begins to float. A sense of disbelief washes over Charles as the tank glides across the surface, propelling forward with surprising grace. "It's working!" Sarah shouts, her voice a mix of joy and disbelief. "Keep going!" Charles maneuvers the tank with newfound confidence, feeling the weight of every second. The tank splashes through the water, a symbol of hope amid chaos. As they reach the halfway point, adrenaline surges through his veins. Suddenly, the tank begins to wobble. Charles's heart races. "Not now!" he exclaims, gripping the steering wheel tightly. But he steadies it, adjusting the throttle. The tank stabilizes, forging ahead. As they reach the riverbank, they climb out, breathless and exhilarated. "We did it!" Charles laughs, disbelief washing over him. It actually worked. But the moment is short-lived. The reality of what they've accomplished sets in. "We need to show this to the command," Sarah urges, a mix of fear and exhilaration in her voice. "If you're hooked on this story, hit that subscribe button," Charles responds, his heart still racing. As they prepare to present their findings, the weight of the world presses down on them. With the war still raging, time is of the essence. They know they must convince their superiors that this innovation could change everything. Charles takes a deep breath, a sense of purpose filling him. The tide has turned, and just like the tank that swam across the Seine, he and Sarah are about to make waves. April 10th, 1945. Headquarters of the U.S. Army, Paris. The air is thick with tension. Officers in crisp uniforms hover around a long wooden table, dimly lit by flickering overhead lights. Maps of the Rhine are sprawled out, littered with red markers signaling failed attempts to breach the German defenses. The mood is somber. A heavy sense of foreboding hangs in the room. Charles sits at one end of the table, his hands clenched tightly around the edges as he observes the discourse unfold. He watches as the generals, seasoned by years of warfare, argue amongst themselves. The conversation is heated, filled with skepticism about any potential plan to cross the Rhine with armored units. "General Patton's forces are stalled," one officer remarks, slamming his fist on the table. "We can't afford to lose more men trying to cross that river with traditional methods." "Nothing has worked so far," another adds, shaking his head in despair. "We need a miracle." Charles's heart races. He knows he holds the key to that miracle, but the weight of authority in the room feels suffocating. He clears his throat, the sound barely cutting through the clamor. "Gentlemen," he begins, his voice steady despite the turmoil inside. "What if we could make our tanks swim?" Laughter erupts. "That's the stupidest thing I've ever heard." One general barks, his derision echoing off the walls. Undeterred, Charles raises his chin. "I've designed a modification that could allow our tanks to cross the Rhine. It's feasible. The laughter dissipates, replaced by silence. The generals exchange glances, their skepticism palpable. "Prove it," a grizzled commander finally says, his tone challenging. Charles swallows hard, feeling the gaze of the room shift heavily onto him. "I need resources and a testing site. If I can demonstrate its viability, then you'll see." The mood in the room changes subtly. Curiosity flickers in some eyes alongside the skepticism. "You have 1 week," another general declares, a hint of disbelief lacing his voice. "Fail, and you'll never speak of this again." As the officers disperse, Charles feels a rush of adrenaline. Outside, the sun is setting, casting a golden glow over Paris. He knows he has little time, and the weight of the world rests on his shoulders. Days pass in a blur of activity. Charles gathers a small team of engineers, each of them as skeptical yet intrigued as the generals had been. They work tirelessly in a makeshift workshop, poring over blueprints and constructing a prototype. "Are you sure about this?" one engineer asks, doubt creeping into his voice. "We have no other choice," Charles replies, his determination unwavering. "This is our chance to turn the tide." The team stays late into the night, the sound of machinery and heated discussions filling the air. Finally, the day of the test arrives. April 17th, 1945, a secluded area near the Rhine. The sky is overcast, heavy clouds shadowing the scene below. Charles stands beside a modified Sherman tank, heart pounding as he addresses his small audience of engineers and military personnel. "Today," he declares, "we prove that our tanks can swim." With hesitant anticipation, they start the engine. The tank lumbers forward toward the riverbank, the water rippling ominously. Charles's hands tremble as he watches his creation. "Engage the flotation system," he shouts as the tank reaches the water's edge. The tank plunges into the Rhine, and panic grips the spectators. It begins to sink, water flooding the crew compartment. Charles's heart plummets. Then, miraculously, the flotation system activates. The tank surfaces, buoyed by its innovative design, and begins to glide across the water. Gasps of astonishment fill the air. "It's working!" one engineer exclaims, excitement lighting his eyes. Charles can hardly believe it himself. The tank completes the crossing, emerging on the opposite bank, triumphant. Cheers erupt from the crowd, joy mingling with disbelief. If you're hooked on this story, hit that subscribe button. Charles feels a swell of pride as he watches the tank rise from the water, a symbol of hope and innovation in a time of despair. Back at headquarters, the atmosphere has shifted dramatically. On April 20th, generals fill the room. The mockery and skepticism have been replaced by intrigue and excitement. "Mr. Charles," a distinguished general addresses him as he approaches the podium. "You've done the impossible. What's next?" Charles stands tall, determination radiating from him. "We need to integrate this system into our armored divisions. We can cross the Rhine and gain strategic advantages." The room buzzes with eagerness and apprehension, generals whispering among themselves. They know the stakes are high. The future of the war rests on these decisions. But doubt still lingers. "We can't risk lives on an untested theory," one old guard insists, shaking his head. Charles feels a surge of anger. The risk is already present. We're losing men every day because we refuse to adapt. This is our opportunity. The silence is deafening. He can see their faces, watch the weighing of options in their eyes, until one young general, inspired by Charles's fervor, finally speaks. "I say we give him a chance, authorize a full-scale operation." A slow nod ripples through the room, and whispers of agreement rise. The commander of the Allied forces, seated at the head of the table, leans forward, eyeing Charles intently. Very well. We will test this in a live combat scenario. Prepare your units. The room erupts in a mixture of cheers and apprehension. Charles feels a rush of relief, but also the weight of expectation crashing down upon him. April 25th, 1945. The banks of the Rhine are alive with activity as soldiers prepare for the first operation using Charles's invention. The sun is shining bright, the air electric with tension and hope. Charles stands with the troops, his heart pounding. He watches as tanks equipped with the flotation system roll into position, ready for the mission that could change the course of the war. Remember, your safety depends on this, he shouts over the roar of engines. Trust the system. As the tanks plunge into the Rhine, Charles can feel the collective breath of the soldiers held tight in their chests. He watches the first unit disappear beneath the surface, panic gripping him again. Then, just as before, the tanks rise, gliding across the water with precision. The soldiers erupt into cheers, and a wave of relief washes over Charles. Reports flood in, detailing the success of the operation. Casualties are reduced by an astonishing 85%. Charles knows they have made history. As he stands at the riverbank watching his tanks cross, he realizes that every struggle, every doubt, has led to this moment. He turns to his team, united by their shared success. "We did it!" he shouts, and they embrace, feeling the warmth of victory surge through them. The Rhine flows behind them, a silent witness to their triumph and innovation, a symbol of what humanity can achieve when courage battles against the impossible. April 10th, 1945. Paris, France. The tension in the air was palpable as Charles stood before a long oak table, the room heavy with the weight of skepticism. Generals and high-ranking officers gathered, their faces etched with doubt. The flicker of candlelight cast shadows on their stern expressions, illuminating the skepticism etched in their eyes. "Mr. O'Brien?" General Patton's voice boomed, cutting through the hushed murmurs. "You understand the stakes here, don't you? The Rhine is no ordinary river. It's a fortress for the Germans." Charles swallowed hard, the weight of the moment pressing down on him. "Yes, sir. But the current technology isn't sufficient. We need an amphibious tank equipped to cross it." His voice trembled slightly, but he pressed on. "I believe I can create a prototype in time for the next offensive." "An amphibious tank?" Major General McAuliffe scoffed, arms crossed, skepticism radiating from him like a storm cloud. "That's the stupidest thing I've ever heard. We don't have time for dreams. This is war, not a science fair." The room erupted in laughter, but Charles remained undeterred. He had faced rejection before, but never in such a high-stakes environment. "I understand your doubts, gentlemen, but our current losses are unacceptable. If we don't innovate, we risk everything." He felt the pulse of urgency thrumming through him. General Patton leaned forward, his steely gaze piercing through Charles. "Very well, present your idea. But understand this. If you fail, the lives lost will weigh on your conscience." Charles inhaled deeply, the air thick with anticipation. "I need resources, men, materials, and a location to conduct tests. The risk of a failed mission is less than the risk of inaction." A heavy silence enveloped the room. The generals exchanged skeptical glances as Charles's heart raced, adrenaline spurring him on. Finally, Patton nodded, his expression unreadable. "You have 1 month. Prove us wrong." With a sense of cautious optimism, Charles left the meeting, determination coursing through his veins. He was not just fighting for recognition. He was fighting for the lives of soldiers who had sacrificed too much already. Days turned into nights as Charles and a small team of engineers worked tirelessly in a makeshift workshop. They toiled under the dim glow of hanging lights, surrounded by the din of machinery and the sharp scent of metal. Blueprints covered the walls like battle plans, every inch marked with calculations and ideas that swirled in their minds. "Do you really think we can pull this off?" asked Lisa, a fellow engineer, wiping sweat from her brow. Charles looked at her, his eyes filled with resolve. "We have to. If we succeed, we can change the tide of the war. Just imagine, tanks that can swim." As they worked, each setback felt like a blow to the gut. Prototype after prototype failed to perform as expected. Tanks tipped over, engines sputtered, and plans crumbled. Yet, amidst the frustration, a flicker of success emerged. On April 20th, the moment of truth arrived. The team gathered on the banks of a small river, their makeshift testing ground. The sun gleamed off the water, reflecting a world of possibilities. Charles stood at the riverbank, nervous energy coursing through him. "This is it," he whispered, glancing at his team. "Let's make history." The modified tank, affectionately dubbed the O'Brien, rumbled forward, entering the water. The sound of gurgling waves filled the air, tension crackling like electricity. Charles held his breath, eyes locked on the vehicle as it floated, hesitating for a fleeting moment before surging ahead. A cheer erupted, but it was short-lived as the tank began to tilt precariously. "Hold steady! Adjust the buoyancy!" Charles shouted, his heart racing. Suddenly the tank stabilized, cutting through the water with newfound grace. It crossed the river, the team roaring with elation. They had done it, against all odds. They had created an amphibious tank. After a frantic month of testing, Charles's triumph caught the attention of the higher-ups. On April 30th, they presented their findings to the command. Charles stood with his team, hearts pounding as they awaited judgment. "Impressive," General Patton remarked, his eyes narrowing as he reviewed the results. "You've reduced potential losses from river crossings, but will it hold up in combat?" "We believe it will," Charles replied, his voice steady, but the anxiety bubbling beneath was palpable. "The O'Brien is not just a tank, it's a lifeline. It will allow our forces to cross rivers without the risk of being decimated by enemy fire." The general nodded slowly, the weight of leadership pressing down on him. "I'll authorize a field test in the next operation. If it succeeds, you will have changed the course of this war." Charles exhaled, a wave of relief washing over him, but the thought of lives depending on his creation settled heavily on his shoulders. Was he ready for that burden? May 1st, 1945, near the Rhine. The atmosphere buzzed with anticipation as Charles watched the amphibious tanks roll forward into the fray. Soldiers climbed aboard, tension etched on their faces. "Remember your training, stay low," an officer shouted as they approached the riverbank. With a roar, the tank splashed into the water, and for a moment, time seemed to stand still. Charles's heart raced as he observed from a distance, praying for success. The O'Brien surged through the Rhine, water lapping at its sides. It crossed the treacherous currents, a wave of hope crashing against despair. Charles's breath caught in his throat as they emerged on the other side, unscathed. The operations report that followed was even better than he ever hoped. Losses during river crossings had indeed reduced by 85%. Soldiers, now armed with a fighting chance, surged forward, reclaiming ground against the Germans. Charles's creation was no longer just a dream. It was a reality, a testament to innovation born of necessity. In the following days, he received commendations and praise, but none of it mattered as much as the lives that were saved. In the months that followed, as the war drew to a close, Charles O'Brien remained humble, his heart heavy with the knowledge of what had been achieved and the lives lost before. He blended back into the ranks of engineers, modest in his victory, knowing that true innovation comes from the courage to challenge the impossible. Sometimes, he would say to those who asked. You must dive into the unknown to find out what lies beneath. As the Allied forces celebrated their victory, Charles's story became one of many, a silent reminder that in the darkest of times, courage can create ripples of change. Innovation doesn't need credentials, it needs courage. What impossible ideas do you think could change the world? Comment below. April 1945. The air over the Rhine River is thick with the scent of smoke and the echoes of artillery fading into a reluctant silence. In the aftermath of the Allied forces' successful crossing, Charles, now a decorated hero, stands alone on the bank of the river. The waters ripple gently, a stark contrast to the chaos that had unfolded just days before. He watches as the last of the American tanks emerged triumphantly on the western shore, their hulls glistening under the pale sun, a testament to the ingenuity that had turned the tide of war. As the dust of battle settles, the ramifications of that audacious swim across the Rhine ripple through history. The crossing, which had been deemed impossible, marked a pivotal point in World War II. It was not merely the physical act of advancing troops and equipment, but the boldness of taking risks that inspired a new era of military tactics. Charles's innovation, born from late-night sketches and fervent brainstorming sessions, had proven that even the most formidable obstacles could be overcome with creativity and courage. Months later, the world is a different place. The war in Europe is drawing to a close, but the shadows of conflict remain long. Charles finds himself back at his desk in Paris, but now it is decorated with commendations and accolades. He is hailed as a pioneer, a visionary, yet he remains humble, often reflecting on the lives lost and the price of victory. This was never about me, he confides to a close friend over coffee. It was about every soldier who believed in the mission. The statistics are staggering. The success at the Rhine resulted in a reduction of losses by nearly 85% in subsequent operations. Military analysts scramble to study the strategies that led to this unprecedented triumph, eager to replicate the conditions that allowed for such an audacious maneuver. Yet, amid the praise, the weight of responsibility hangs heavy on Charles's shoulders. These numbers represent not only victories, but also the sacrifices made by countless individuals, reminding him that innovation must serve humanity, not just military might. In the years that follow, the legacy of the Rhine crossing becomes a cornerstone of military education and strategy. Generals across the globe study the operation, dissecting each decision, each maneuver, searching for the magic formula that Charles had seemingly stumbled upon. But behind the charts and graphs lies a deeper lesson that transcends the battlefield. Charles knows that true innovation requires more than just technical know-how. It demands a willingness to challenge the status quo, to embrace the unknown, even when the odds are stacked against you. Sitting quietly in his modest home, Charles often reflects on the men he worked alongside, the engineers and soldiers who dared to believe in his vision. One night, he uncovers an old journal filled with sketches and calculations. Flipping through the pages, he finds a quote he had written during those frantic days of brainstorming. "Innovation doesn't need credentials. It needs courage." It resonates with him now more than ever, a reminder that the spark of creativity can ignite change that reshapes history. Years later, in 1969, as Charles watches the first men walk on the moon, he understands the full magnitude of that lesson. The Apollo program, built on the backs of dreamers like him, is proof that the human spirit can soar beyond the confines of Earth, much like the tanks that once swam across the Rhine. The heart of innovation beats strongest not in the halls of power or in the hands of the privileged, but within those willing to take risks for a greater good. Now in his twilight years, Charles becomes a mentor to young engineers and soldiers. He speaks passionately at military academies and universities, sharing his experiences and encouraging others to think outside conventional boundaries. Every challenge is an opportunity, he tells them, his voice steady and powerful. Don't wait for permission. Create your own path. As he nears the end of his journey, Charles pens a letter to the families of the soldiers who fought in the war, expressing his gratitude and sorrow for their sacrifices. "We are forever indebted to you," he writes, his pen trembling with emotion. "Your loved ones believed in a cause larger than themselves, and it is their courage that gives meaning to our innovations." The letter becomes a cherished piece of history, a testament not only to Charles's legacy, but to the collective spirit of resilience that defines humanity. In the end, the Rhine crossing is remembered not just for its tactical brilliance, but as a symbol of hope. Hope that innovation, when fueled by courage and empathy, can lead to profound change. The final chapter of Charles's life is marked by a quiet reflection on the world he helped shape. As his time draws near, surrounded by family and friends, he speaks softly about his dreams for the future. "What impossible ideas do you think could change the world?" he asks, a twinkle in his eye. In his last moments, Charles embodies the very essence of his life's work: to inspire others to dare greatly, to innovate boldly, and to never underestimate the power of a single idea. As he closes his eyes for the final time, the weight of his legacy lingers in the air, a call to action for all who follow. Innovation doesn't need credentials. It needs courage.